This last week, we started a two-part series of lessons. We started, the first one was talking about carpe diem, meaning seizing the day. And we began by looking at Paul's message in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15 through 21. Some portions of that were read by us, by Brother Santos. In those, Paul identifies three specific things or areas that we as Christians should be seizing the day in. We looked at wisdom. We said that we are to be seizing the day in learning God's wisdom, drawing off of the Lord's wisdom, and then not only drawing off of that wisdom, but then walking circumspectly, walking carefully in that wisdom like wise men, not as unwise men, drawing upon that so that we can share that wisdom with others. But then we talked about we also need to seize the moment in time. We need to understand that we need to make the most of time because we have to recognize that our time in this world is relatively short. James tells us that our lives are like vapors, and therefore we need to make the most of every moment that we have within this world and eagerly then serve the Lord. Do everything that we can to lay up treasures in heaven the way that we are asked to bear fruit for the Lord. But then we also need to seize the moment in our gratitude. We need to understand that just as Paul mentioned in verse 20 through 21, we need to be thankful for all things. Not just the good things, but also the bad things. It's obvious that we are thankful when good things are given to us. But what happens when we are suffering, when we are dealing with hardships, when we're dealing with things that are uncomfortable in nature? Do we then glorify God then? Do we thank the Lord then? Not only for the things that we are dealing with, but the fact that we are dealing with them helps us. It produces something. It strengthens us. It helps us to grow. And then that we use those times. We don't allow that suffering that we're dealing with to go to waste. We glorify the Lord in there. We show others what the Lord has done for us, even during our times of hardship. Now, leaving that last week, we left off and we said that although looking at this list here of three things, it sounds pretty straightforward and pretty simple, but we understand that a lot of times we fail to seize the day. And we said the reason for that is because, we know the areas, but sometimes we fail to know the how. How do we do that? How do I do that? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to continue on with our study in this lesson, and we're going to look at the how. How do I need to train myself to seize the day, which is the title of today's lesson. So if you're not already there, we should be in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 23. And just to give you kind of a background of what has been transpiring thus far, this letter, Paul has been essentially reprimanding and answering a lot of different questions about this church in Corinth. And this first letter, Paul starts off just a whirlwind of reprimands that he gives those in Corinth. He talks about division that they had amongst them, the lack of humility that they were showing towards one another, the fact that they were turning a blind eye when there was sexual immorality within their midst in chapter 5. He talks about how they were squabbling with one another and bringing each other into courts to kind of settle the disputes in chapter 7, or in chapter 6, how they were violating the marriage law in chapter 7, and also how they were showing a lack of love for one another, causing some to violate their own conscience by eating meat that was sacrificed to idols in chapter 8. But then in chapter 9, Paul starts off this chapter speaking about his right. His right, defending his discipleship or his apostleship, but also his right to gain reward from that. In other words, draw support for the work that he was doing in the gospel. And he points to the fact that he, no different than anyone else that is doing the gospel, should be supported or can draw support for the work that they were doing. And then in verses 16 through 22, he now talks about his drive for doing the evangelistic work. Why is he doing what he is doing? And then he goes on and he says, look, I made myself a slave to all so that I may win the more, in verses 19. And he says, I became all things to all men. To the Jew, I became a Jew. To those who were under the law, I became as one who was under the law. To those that were not under the law, like one that was not under the law. And to the one who was weak, I became like one who was weak. Now, he's not saying that I just adopted all of their practices. What he is saying is, I met them where they were. I went and I came to their level and I taught them from there. And why did he do that? He tells us in verse 22, so that I might save some. I might win those to the gospel. Now, with that being the focus, he says all things he did for the sake of the gospel. That's the context of what we're going to be reading. So Paul then now gives us the how. How did he do this? How did he prepare himself for that type of mission? And he goes and tells us that by pointing at a familiar picture. This morning we were talking about parables and how Christ gives us a parable that is tied to reality. Paul now ties a reality. He talks about athletes and how they prepare for a race. So look with me in verse 24, or we'll start in verse 23 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says, I do all things for the sake of the gospel so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Do you not know that those who run a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control. In all things, they then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way, not without aim. I box in such a way, not as beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Now, Paul goes and looks at this, and he tells us there are specifically 3 ways that we need to seize the day. How we can train ourselves to seize the day. Now, whenever I don't know about you, but every time that the Olympics come on, I'm just mesmerized by the things that are happening there. I'm mesmerized by the athletes. I'm mesmerized by the competitions and the different races and the different disciplines that are being shown. Why? Because I see what these men and women go ahead and put themselves through so that they can compete at this level. It is superb. It is awesome to watch them. And I admire what they are doing, how they are competing at that level, but also what it took to get to that level, because not everybody can get there. They devote themselves completely, time, monetarily, living, always going ahead and enduring intense and grueling training, starting often at a young age, cutting through all kinds of things, cutting away things from their lives, things that are just basic that we would say, well, I can't do without that. And they do without it for years. Why? So that not only will they be able to compete in those games, but so that they can win. That's their goal. Their goal isn't to be there and take, just honorable mention. They're there so that they can win. And this is exactly why I believe Paul then uses this example of an athlete to tell us those 3 specific ways on how we need to train to seize the day. So let's look at the very first one. The very first one is we need to gain motivation by focusing on a singular and clear goal. Look in verses 23 and 24. He says, I do all things for the sake of the gospel so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Paul points to the athlete and says the athlete, when he or she goes at that game, is all going to win. They are looking for that clear goal, that singular kind of goal, that clear-cut path where they're going. And he then says, I do the same thing. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, partaking of it so that I can partake of it as well. That is his goal. That's what his central focus was. But why the gospel? What's so important about the gospel? In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul says that I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to those who believe. You see, Paul understood that the gospel led to salvation, and it was a mission that was given to him to preach and to teach the gospel. And if he didn't do it, there would be some pretty bad detrimental kind of effects to it, both to himself and to others. Look in verse 16 of chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16, he says, "For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast. But for I am under compulsion, for woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." He says, I have to preach the gospel. And if I don't, there are some pretty steep consequences for me if I do not preach this gospel. Because this is the message, this is the gospel, this is what the mission that I've been provided by God to do. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And to kind of forsake it, to let it go and not do it, well, then I am violating what God has already told me to do. But also he says, I have become all things to all men in verse 22, so that I may by all means save some. If I don't deliver the message, then somebody may not hear the message, and therefore that person who does not hear the message will not receive the message because they will not believe the message, and therefore they will be lost. You see, when we don't deliver the word, if Paul said, you know what, I'm just not going to preach it here, then somebody could potentially be lost because of that. That's the singular goal, the priority of Paul. And then he sinks everything he's got into running, that is working to deliver that gospel message. Not to just to deliver it, but to live it. And while striving then to win that race, to complete the mission, to do God's will. Now, this is a silly example, I know, because if you're looking at that, you're probably like, why is there SpongeBob up there? Because that's the way my mind works. Okay? Because my daughter, when she was younger, she watched SpongeBob every day, constantly, all the time. That's it. That's what we had on the TV. So I got very acquainted with SpongeBob. And there is one episode that for some reason, while I was doing this study, that's what popped into my head. There's this one episode where SpongeBob is going ahead and they're trying to teach him how to be a waiter of a fine dining establishment. And they tell him, because he can't get it, he can't memorize all this stuff, and he tells him, all I want you to do is clear your mind of everything, and all you think of is fine dining and breathing. That's it. And that's exactly what he does. He clears all the thoughts in his mind, and all he does is fine dining and breathing. And you know how he did? He was awesome as a waiter. Now, it ended up pretty funny and pretty bad, but that's not the point. The point is, why? Because his focus, his priority was only that. And therefore, he sunk everything he had. Every thought that he had was only that. Well, it's the same exact thing that Paul is saying here. He's saying, I do all things for the sake of the gospel. Because that has been entrusted not only to Paul, but to you and I. See, the gospel has been given to us as I was talking to Sister Pam about being a steward. The gospel has been granted to us as stewards. What are we doing with it? How are we utilizing it? Are we sharing it with others? And no different than Paul, we are also entrusted and must do something with that gospel. If we wish to seize the day in our wisdom, sharing it with others of the gospel, and use our time living and teaching the gospel, and also continuing to demonstrate our gratitude to God. Why? Because of the gospel. Then I need to know how to seize the day. I need to make sure that I have a single motivation in my life, a clear-cut goal. So let us, in the same manner, make sure that we're preparing ourselves for that race, striving, hyper-focused on that one priority, developing then a strong drive, a strong and fervent drive. You see, Paul says he was talking to the church at Rome, and he tells them in chapter 12 of Romans chapter 12, verse 11, he tells them that they need not be lagging behind in diligence, but fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. We need to be, that word fervent means on fire. We need to be boiling over. We need to ensure that when we have the gospel in us, it's something that cannot be contained. We need to share it. We need to boil it. It should be boiling out of us. We should be on fire for the word. But that single-minded approach, when we are that way, then it will help us in every decision we make, every interaction we take, every problem we face. All of it will go back to that priority because everything falls under that priority. If all my thoughts are on preaching and teaching and making sure that others are being delivered the gospel, how I treat others is going to fall in line with the gospel. How I act is going to fall in line with the gospel. What I say is going to fall in line with the gospel. Everything is going to be focused on that. And that then motivates us. It keeps us pushing forward to do exactly what we're supposed to. I want to ask you, how many of us have something that is just, we would say, that is the thing that motivates me the most. It's something that is just, something that I just love to do. When we have something that we love to do, that we're fervent or passionate about, do we not want to do it? Do we not want to talk about it? Do we not want to kind of engage in it? Well, of course. We find every excuse in the book to try and do that specific thing. Well, why not the gospel? If we're fervent about the word, shouldn't we want to do and teach and show that specific thing as well? You see, Paul said in Philippians chapter 3, verse 13, I love the way he puts it. Because he says that motivation isn't just because he was motivated for some physical kind of blessing that we receive. I'm not doing it because God blesses me if I do those things. Yes, God does bless me, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm not preaching or teaching or learning the gospel because God is going to give me something in return, because then that would be me earning my way into heaven. We're not earning anything. I don't deserve anything. But here, what Paul tells us is the reason that he was so focused wasn't for a physical blessing. It wasn't for a physical crown. It was for the imperishable crown. That crown of eternal life in heaven. Paul says this in Philippians chapter 3, verse 13 through 14. He says, "Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind, I'm reaching forward to what lies ahead. I press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." What is he saying? He's saying, I am so fervent that I'm forgetting the problems and the things that I've done wrong in the past. I'm pressing forward. My goal is in front of me, not behind me. And therefore, I'm going to sink everything I can to reach that goal. So what we first must do is develop that fervent spirit. Work with that singular goal. But in addition to that, Paul then goes on with the next portion. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 and 25, actually 25, verse 25, he says, "Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things." The second thing that we have to do to be able to develop, to train ourselves, to seize the moment, is that we must develop self-control in all things. Now, what is meant by self-control? When we talk about self-control, the dictionary kind of definition, the Strong's dictionary definition of this word means to exhibit self-government, to conduct oneself temperately. You see, it is essentially saying that we have to master or control our desires and our passions. We need to ensure that we are regulating what we're doing and control ourselves from doing things that we're not supposed to. When we think of the athlete that he's talking here about, he says the one who competes does this. Well, the athlete, if you think back to that Olympic athlete, they regulate and master control off of every aspect of their lives. I mean, if you ever saw the training regimen and the things that they have to go through, they regulate the diet. They regulate and control their sleep pattern. They make sure that their exercise is correct. You know, I was talking to somebody just yesterday, and they were saying that they go in there and they have to make sure before they go to sleep that the temperature and the humidity levels and all of that is ideal for their sleep, so that their sleep schedule is correct, so that they will not be at a disadvantage when they go and compete. And then also they limit themselves, foregoing social kind of interaction and social norms that we kind of take for granted. It takes a massive amount of self-control, self-restraint by an athlete to prepare to potentially win a gold medal. And this is no different for a Christian. You see, we need to be seeking to seize that day with that singular priority, which is the gospel, always understanding that we're running a race. So we have to prepare for that. And that means we have to control ourselves. Because the truth is, brethren, we are spiritual athletes. We must then exercise restraint, not in just one portion of our lives, one aspect of our lives. We do it great, awesome, that's awesome, but what about the rest? See, we are to do it, as Paul says, in all things we are to exercise self-control. Not in one, but all things. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 to 23, Paul, before he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, he says in verses 16 that we need to walk in the Spirit. In verses 18, he says we need to be led in the Spirit. And he says if we are truly led in the Spirit and not by the flesh, then we will demonstrate those fruits of the Spirit. And what are those fruits of the Spirit? Verses 23 through 22 to 23 tells us love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You see, when we look at that very next verse, verse 24, he follows this up and he says that those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we are going to crucify the flesh with its passions and desires, we are putting it to death. Do you know how much self-control that takes? To go ahead and put your passions, the things that you want, put them aside. That's really hard. That's extremely difficult. But not only this is what was expected. This is what is expected of us. But Peter follows this up. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, Peter states that the Christian, upon their faith, needs to build upon their faith. And he says, then on their faith, they need to then build moral excellence and knowledge and self-control and perseverance and godliness and brotherly kindness and love. How many of us would look at that list and say, hey, you know what? I can scrap moral excellence and knowledge. I don't really need perseverance or godliness. Brotherly kindness, and love, okay, I can do without that. None of us would look at this, but you know what? Sometimes we look at self-control and that's how we treat it. We don't even give it a second thought. We kind of pull it out and say, well, you know what? I really can't control myself. And therefore, God made me that way. And that's not what we're told here. Self-control is in both of these lists, identifying the importance of it. And Peter even states that the one who lacks any of these qualities, including self-control, therefore is rendered useless, unfruitful, and having forgotten their purification from their sins. You see, when I have no self-control, then when I am baptized for the remission of my sins, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to sin again. Because I have no self-control. And I'm just going to do whatever I feel like because I'm not going to control myself. We need to understand that self-control is absolutely vital. But I want you to understand, a lot of times we look at self-control and we say it's abstinence from something specific. And yes, that's true. But you understand that it is all of the things that we do, every aspect of our lives. You see, we have to also control our tongues. And this is something that we have a problem with. This is something that's very, very difficult to do. That's why James talks about it as this little member that can cause such a big fire. You see, we need to control in what manner we talk to one another and what manner we talk to those that are outside of these walls. Because the simple truth is, at times, brethren, we become a little loose-lipped with those that we care about the most. You know, sometimes we kind of just let it fly to those who understand us. It doesn't matter. Your feelings don't really matter, because you know what? You know me. I'm comfortable with you. And therefore it allows me the kind of the leverage or kind of the leniency to go beyond those things. And we treat those that we don't know a lot better than those that we do know. We have to be careful. The simple fact is, we do have to control our tongues. We need to ensure that we're not lying to one another, that we're not cursing one another, that we're not gossiping about one another, that we're not causing strife or division within the church especially, but instead focus on the gospel. That's why James says, you know what? That when we're using our tongues, we shouldn't be blessing God and at the same time going ahead and cursing man, which is in the image of God. Because we cannot kind of make two different opposed things come out of the same mouth. We shouldn't be going ahead and producing two opposites from our mouths. Why is that? Because exactly what Christ tells us in Matthew chapter 15, verse 18. When we speak, the things that come out of our mouths, they are coming from our hearts. And that is what defiles a man. You see, when I say those evil or wicked things, when I gossip about my brothers or sisters in Christ, when I go ahead and just let loose because I just feel like it, you know what? That's coming from my heart. That's in there. That's a heart problem. That's something that I need to change in my heart. But you know what? It's not just that I need to bridle my tongue, because I do need to bridle my tongue and make sure that I am seasoning every word that I say with love and with the gospel in mind. But I also need to make sure that I am taking notice of my temper as well, my actions. You know, I've heard Christians go ahead and excuse their behaviors and how they interact with other people, saying, you know what? Hey, look, that's just the way I am. Or when they lose their temper or they lose their cool, they just go off on people. They say, hey, you know what? That person should have known better than to go ahead and kind of poke the bear. That person should have known better than to get me upset, to get me to that point. Brother, are we called to give what we get? Because I look at the scriptures, I don't see that. What I see in the scriptures is what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12, verses 17 and 21, where he says, never pay back evil for evil, and not to be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul also continues this on as he says, you know what? When you have an enemy, let vengeance be taken by God. Instead, you do good to that enemy so that the coals or the burning coals will fall upon his head. I'm not saying that you're trying to get him back with good. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that maybe you will have a spark in that person's heart so that they will understand what they are doing by the way that you react to the things that you have. Have you ever, there's been times that as a nurse, I remember as a school nurse, there's been times where I've picked up the phone as a school nurse and the parent on the other line is absolutely livid. They are just mad as can be. And they're not going to let me get a word in edgewise. They're just yelling at me. Full-fledged yelling. And you know what you do? You let them burn themselves out. You just go. Okay, you're just listening. And it's difficult to listen and listen and listen and listen and just hear them going, and they don't take a breath. And they're just going. And then they're finished. And when they're finished, then you go ahead and you talk to them. And they are calmer. They're able to kind of control themselves. Why? Because they let it all out. Now, let me tell you, that's not what we should be doing as Christians. What we should be doing as Christians is the other person on the other line that is holding themselves and saying, I'm going to control myself regardless of what you're going to do. We must learn to exercise control, self-control in every aspect of our lives, always centrally motivated by the gospel. Now, finally, the last thing that we see here is that Paul also says that we need to diligently exercise and train. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 26 and 27, Paul ends this section by referring back to that athlete and how their training undergoes that preparation so that they can win that race. And in addition to monitoring and abstaining from certain activities, that athlete also diligently trains day and night, ensuring that they're prepared to be able to go out there. And we can understand this. Because none of us, I would venture to say, none of us would say, you know what, I'm going to run a marathon tomorrow. I think each and every one of us, well, I would probably say, I'm not running a marathon ever. But if we were, I think we would prepare just a little bit. I think we would get ready. And that's the exact same thing as being a Christian. That's the exact same thing as preparing ourselves to seize that day. You see, training, it's not just training at all. You know, it's not just doing something, not just getting out there, but it's training with a purpose. Notice Paul says, I train not without aim. I run not without aim. There's a specific goal. I'm going to a specific place. I'm not just running in circles, doing all kinds of things. And he says, I box. When I box, he says, I am not just boxing to beat the air. In other words, I'm not just swinging wildly. I'm connecting every single time. And then that's why he says, if I do that, it falls in line with the gospel being centered, being focused, having that purpose and having that priority in life. But notice he also says that when we train and when we exercise as athletes, that we also have to understand it is not going to be an easy session. I tell you, when I was in high school, I went into track, indoor, outdoor, and cross country. And I had never run ever. And I went in there, and I remember that first year. That was one of the toughest years I've ever had in my life. It hurt so bad. Every single session hurt like nobody's business. And every time I finished, I felt like weeks of recovery would take place. It hurt so bad. But that's what training is. It builds your body to do something. That's why Paul says, I discipline my body. Some translations have, I buffet my body. What does buffet mean? Buffet actually means to beat black and blue, to bruise it, to harden it. If you ever think of a kickboxer will hit a hard, solid object over and over and over again so that he will harden their legs. They will go ahead, and boxers will take punches to the gut so that they will harden their stomachs. That is what he means by this. I will buffet my body. I will discipline it and make sure that I am prepared so that when Satan hits me with a solid right, I'm not just going to crumble. I'm going to be able to take the hit because I have learned, I have done something, I've prepared to do that. You know, look with me in Revelation really fast. In Revelation chapter 2. In Revelation chapter 2 and 3, I want you to notice something. There's a consistent message that continues to be sent here every single time. You see, our spiritual readiness is dictated by how well we train, and our endurance is as well. In chapter 2, verse 7, every time he's talking to the 7 churches of Asia, look at the last message, the message that he continues to give each one of these churches. He says in verse 7, to him who overcomes, I will grant to eat the tree of life, which is in paradise of God. In verse 11, he says to Smyrna, he who overcomes will not hurt by the second death. To Pergamum, in verse 17, he says, to him who overcomes, to him I will give some of the hidden manna. To Thyatira, in verse 26, he says, to he who overcomes, He who overcomes will keep my deeds until the end. To him I will give authority over the nations. In chapter 3, verse 5, he talks to Sardis. He says, he who overcomes thus will be clothed in white garments. In chapter 3, verse 12, he says to Philadelphia, he who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of God. In verse 21, to Laodicea, he says, he who overcomes, I will grant to him to sit. Why am I saying all of this? Do you notice the one message that continues to be said over and over again? He who overcomes. See, it's not how good we start the race that matters. It's where do we end the race? That's what matters. Are we going to complete the race, or are we just going to give up? And our endurance will dictate, are we going to continue to push forward, or are we just going to give up when it gets hard? That's why Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6, he says that we need to be constantly nourished on the word and the faith of the doctrine. We need to have the right diet. He says in verse 7 that we need to discipline for the purpose of godliness and not discipline for the sake of the body, because the body goes away, it does away. We need to avoid those worthless things of this world, not get caught up in the things that don't matter. And then he says we need to discipline or we need to labor and strive and focus on God, fixing our eyes on the hope of the living God in verse 10. It isn't simply just knowing the word, but is actively pursuing to do the word. I want you to understand it is practicing what we know. You see, similar to athletes, if we want to be ready to seize every opportunity to do God's will, we need to not just have the knowledge of what to do, but we need to also, as I said, buffet the body. The spiritual body has to be tested. We need to continue to work it over and over and over again. We need to make sure that we're taking those blows, those strikes before Satan hits us. So what does Hebrews chapter 5, verse 13 tells us? See, Hebrews, after reproving those Christians who were not spiritually mature because they had only continued to eat or be able to live off of the milk of the word and weren't strong enough, they hadn't grown enough. He says that the way that we achieve maturity is to practice, have their senses trained to discern good and evil. That's how we become mature. That's how we become stronger. We become stronger by living the word, not just talking about the word, not just knowing the word, but doing it out there, putting it in front of everybody, ensuring that, yes, when we get challenged, that we can speak about those things. And when we can't, learn what we need to learn and then come back and be able to address it again. That's how we become stronger. So my question then to you is, are we willing to seize every opportunity? Have we been preparing ourselves for training? Are we confident and motivated to do so? Because, brethren, if we're not trained, we're not going to do it. If we're not ready, we're not going to do it. There was a saying in the military, you train the way you fight. That means you do exactly what you're going to do in live combat. Why? Because you have that muscle memory. Brethren, if we don't live the gospel, I guarantee you, when we go out in the world, we're not going to live the gospel either. We're not going to do the things of the Lord. If we don't know the gospel, we're not going to do the gospel. And if we don't live the gospel, we ain't going to train somebody else to do it, because nobody's going to listen to us. So my question, as we wrap this up, last week, we looked at the fact that we have to seize the moment in our wisdom, in our time, and in our gratitude. And then Paul shows us the how. He says we need to do it in a clear and singular goal, having self-control and exercising and training our spiritual bodies. So my question to you is quite simply this: are you trained and ready to seize the day? If you're one who has not accepted the gospel call, has not accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior, I will tell you right now, you have not begun to train yourself for the fight that Satan will bring. But the beauty is that the Lord calls you and beckons you and gives you this opportunity. Will you seize today, right now? Will you take this moment and come to Christ? But if you're one who has already come to Christ and you look at your life and you notice, you know what? When it comes to spiritual exercise, I haven't done much. I'm not really strong, so maybe we want to change that today. Won't you change that? If there's any way that we can help you, if there's anything that we can do for you on your behalf, please come forward as we stand and sing the song of encouragement.